Hello, everybody. Welcome everyone to the next iteration of the Literature of Sustainability series being hosted by the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. We are delighted to have our regulars, and a lot more of the people who are coming in are new ones from what I can see. But above all, thanks very much to Stacey Balkan, who has been keeping unearthly hours to give us this talk today. SDG 7, the subject of today's talk. As some of you know, we have been running through the series, and Stacey is an energy humanities specialist. So we expect to see something really fascinating coming out of what she has to say. Welcome to all of you. Welcome back to my colleague and faculty fellow, Professor Anna Kurian, who was missing for a couple of these talks. Hi, Anna. And to Atul, who makes much of the logistics possible. For more formal introductions, over to you, Atul, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, sir, and welcome everyone to today's talk. And if I may formally introduce Professor Balkan to you. Stacey Balkan is Associate Professor of Environmental Literature and Humanities at Florida Atlantic University, where she also serves as a faculty affiliate for the Center for Peace, Justice, and Human Rights and the School of Environmental, Coastal, and Ocean Sustainability. She is the author of Rogues in the Post-Colony, Narrating Extraction and Itinerancy in India, published by the West Virginia University Press 2022, and the co-editor of Oil Fictions, World Literature and Our Contemporary Petrosphere, Penn State University Press. Stacey is also a member of the Petrocultures Research Group and the After Oil School, with whom she collaborated on Solarities, Seeking Energy Justice, Minnesota University Press 2022. Her work on energy justice and just futures is also forthcoming in several volumes, including Energized, 101 Words for a New Politics of Energy, and the Routledge Companion to Literature and Environment, and Energy Humanities, Options for Teaching, published by the Modern Language Association. Her talk today is titled Bicycling in Paradise, on Radical Cadence and Just Futures in the End Times. Over to you, Professor Balkan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that generous and very flattering introduction. Thank you, Pramod, for inviting me to participate in this really marvelous and important series. Thank you also to Anna for inviting me, for coordinating the series. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm just gonna get started. My slide should be up there. Let me make sure I can. Okay. Is the slideshow working? Why is this not working?
Not yet. No, not yet.
Okay. Let me try this again. Perhaps if I unshare. Let me just. So I hope that this talk today adds to this ongoing and really, as I said before, kind of marvelous series. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about SDG 7 today, affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Okay, so in their introduction to the recent anthology, Power Shift, Keywords for a New Politics of Energy, Imre Zeman and Jennifer Wenzel argue that a, quote, multi-scalar politics of the earth and the atmosphere and oceans, end quote, is necessary for the decolonization of global energy infrastructures. One that might contravene the sedimented habits of, for example, states or provinces. Such a multi-scalar politics, contends mobility justice advocate Mimi Scheller, must also acknowledge urban spaces and their infrastructures as, quote, articulations of a biopolitical and planetary urbanization that permeates and works across all scales at once. Which is to say that everyday embodied relations of racialization or gender are clear manifestations of an entrenched global petroculture and one that thrives on the persistent exploitation of the planetary poor. On the level of the city, where we must also consider modes of micromobility, including bicycles, either as primary vehicles or as supplemental to public transportation infrastructures, scale is a particularly critical consideration in the struggle toward energy justice, or the provision of an equitable system of energy based upon, quote, what ought to be accomplished per energy humanist Simony Howe, rather than, quote, what can be accomplished. The struggle for something like energy justice, whether on a planetary or municipal level, resonates with one of the benchmarks set by the 2015 UN Sustainability Development Goals. SDG 7 stipulates, quote, access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all in a world in which 645 million people still lack access to basic electricity as of the UN's 2025 report. Certainly, such terms as affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern demand further explanation, if also similar attention to scale. Nonetheless, in the face of the muscular nationalism being flexed by rogue actors, including the United States, the UN stands as amongst the few institutions capable of helping to forge such a multi-scalar and planetary politics. That is, for shepherding legislation aimed toward multi-species survival and redistributive justice. Taking for granted that a multi-scalar politics would in fact acknowledge the relationship between the planetary and the bodily, SDG 7 potentially attends to energy justice at the level of the city, the burden of my argument regarding micromobility in the following pages. Today's talk, also the first chapter of my current book project, Bicycling in Paradise on Radical Cadence and Just Futures in the End Times, centers transport in the form of micromobility and mobility justice, both of which demand a thorough divestment from fossil fuels and a robust investment in public transit and transportation infrastructures untethered from the gospel of automobility. It's widely acknowledged that such a divestment is well underway, although it isn't clear that any correlative investment in public transit, nor micromobility initiatives such as bicycle infrastructures, will follow. Nor is it clear that a true divestment from fossil capital, for example from plastics, which account for the material possibility of many of our most cherished habits, will happen in time to avert catastrophe. Energy historian Caleb Wellham, reading the petro-populist 1978 film Convoy, reminds us that earlier efforts toward a transition away from automobility were stifled by popular sentiment celebrating America as a saga of motion and the open road as the ultimate symbol of American freedom. Repackaged in the recent Ford Ram campaign that boasts of a collective inability to, quote, stop being American, something apparently illustrated in putting, quote, V8s back on the strip. Such petro-propaganda continues to stifle our imaginations, even as the petro-populists now cling to their dying dreams of unfettered automotive speed. I should mention that this project and today's talk focus on mostly US cities, but it ought to be noted that the American nostalgia for fossil fuels and fossil-fueled transport is increasingly odd, most closely mirrored by the Canadian province of Alberta. Meanwhile, nations such as China are leading the way in the production of renewable power. Their, quote, green soft power, for example, also particularly effective after the gutting of USAID and, of course, the recently announced withdrawal from UNESCO. Arguably, the reactionary nationalism of the US signals an implicit acknowledgement of the imminent transition, if one that the Trump administration is loath to accept, given the enormous contributions of the oil and gas industries to the MAGA movement. Hence commercials for combustion engines that appear almost laughable. Indeed, while the ecocidal policies of late begin to take hold, environmental journalist Jonathan Mingle nonetheless observes that, quote, clean energy has acquired too much momentum to simply grind to a halt. Last year, 94% of newly installed electric capacity in the US was drawn from solar, batteries, and wind. Thus, Zeman and Wenzel also begin their introduction by noting that the, quote, end of fossil fuels is closer than you might think. Although this end is less a discrete moment than a protracted process in the making. We know from studies such as Jean-Baptiste Frézeau's More and More and More, an all-consuming history of energy, and Zeman's voluminous and influential work on transition, that petroleum did not replace coal, nor did coal replace wind or steam. Energy as power is a cultural and material bricolage often constituted by an improvisatory network that mobilizes coal, solar, and petroleum-fueled, quote, energy toward basic survivability in various corners of the planet. This includes the African states, about which Aaron Dean and Kristen Phillips write in their entry on Africa for Power Shift. This also includes the US's aging grid, which may likewise be described in terms of a kind of bricolage, with renewables occupying ever-increasing market shares. Of course, renewability does not automatically imply clean nor affordable. In the present talk, I thus also consider the calculus being applied when arriving at cost in the context of an uneven global energy infrastructure powered largely by often invisibilized fossil capital. And I similarly query understandings of, quote, clean energy and the means through which global emissions and their impacts are uneven by design. In what follows, I begin with a reflection on Ivan Ilyich's powerful indictment of uneven energy systems, the 1973 Energy and Equity, which was written at a moment of reckoning for ecological economists, before considering both the enduringly uneven infrastructures that continue to plague the global poor, as well as the cultural institutions and aesthetic forms that operate either in concert with infrastructural apartheid, or those more utopian fictions that imagine renewable futures untethered from extant networks of extractive capital. As an energy humanist trained in literary studies, I see such fictions as revolutionary gestures, their authors as the architects of future worlds. Paulo Paulo's graphic memoir, All My Bicycles, Becky Chambers's A Psalm for the Wild Built, and select Bitopian tales, penned by micromobility activist and feminist critic Ellie Blue, shall offer praxes for this tentative claim. A claim made more defiantly in works such as Ilyich's, if also a slew of recent philosophical works pertaining to just futures and economic growth. Casey Williams, in a powerful reflection on Kohei Saito's argument for degrowth communism, concludes that, like many similar such manifestos, not unlike Ilyich's, Saito offers a robust dream of a better world without a, quote, roadmap for how to get there. I believe that Ilyich's argument regarding what he terms the, quote, tools of conviviality, amongst them the lowly bicycle, might be part of that map, if only a modest step. And do you turn to the next slide? Thank you. So on energy and equity. Arguing that democracy requires forms of energy that can be metabolized without the employment of, quote, energy, this term, human and non-human, in Energy and Equity, Ivan Ilyich made a powerful case for a threshold beyond which the quanta of energy expended has an inverse relationship to planetary flourishing. This sentiment reflected contemporary debates around the biophysical limits of economic growth, while also gesturing toward the imperative to decolonize a global energy system that required the maintenance of sacrifice zones, places invisibilized by the uneven infrastructure of fossil capitalism. Contemporary accounts of such uneven infrastructures were also and notably captured in popular fiction of the time. Samuel Delaney's 1968, We and Some Strange Power Employ Move on a Rigorous Line, features the, quote, Global Power Commission and its mobile Gila monster to name the planet-sprawling grid that Ilyich categorically indicts. Delaney would also situate his critique in the context of the struggle for civil rights in the United States in the enduring racial supremacy of extant networks of power, showcasing the intimacies between political and electrical power through a band of grid-rejecting outlaws delusionally clinging to what Wendy Walters terms the masculinist petro-imaginary of the 20th century. Reading Energy and Equity today, we might further develop such a critique, nascent as it was in Ilyich's foundational condemnation of automobility and social inequality, responding to what he characterized as a, quote, energy crisis manufactured in service to the automobile and petroleum industries who collectively balked at the burgeoning conversation around, quote, economic degrowth. We might also turn to considerations of what Bictopia author Ellie Blue terms the petro-patriarchy to name the intimacies between gender oppression and extractive capitalism, something that Ilyich would in fact undertake in the 1982 Gender, but which has yet to gain sufficient traction in discussions around, quote, transition, particularly as those discussions are increasingly being hijacked by the agents of renewable extractive capitalism. It goes without saying, as the fossil capitalists call for women to return to the kitchen, that the petro-patriarchy remains firmly entrenched, and thus revisiting Ilyich with the hindsight of decades of political struggle against the forces of a petro-patriarchy lately emboldened by renewed calls to, quote, drill baby drill, is urgent indeed. 50 years after the text's original publication, cataclysmic shocks to global climate, which unevenly plague our planetary community, offer a chilling illustration of the failures to heed the obvious ecological wisdom of economic degrowth, which is to say, the systematic reduction in consumption posed by ecological economists and popularized by such fora as the Club of Rome's 1972 report, the, quote, limits of growth. Or, per Dominic Boyer, quote, a way that the North discovers what the South has known for centuries, that capitalism is predatory and creates its luxuries for the few from the miseries of the many. Such outlandish predation was described by Illich's contemporary, André Gortz, as a, quote, poverty of affluence, quote, innovation through dispossession that also frames what mobility justice advocates, including Scheller, describe as a, quote, kinetic politics that allows for elite actors and the goods that they consume to move freely while the transit impoverished, many of whom are undocumented, remain largely stuck. Such a, quote, poverty of affluence may also be glimpsed in the planned power outages that serve the hyperconsumption of that kinetic elite. So too in the gross underinvestment in public spaces and the accelerated privatization of formerly public transportation infrastructures. Consequently, Illich and others doing similar work was concerned not merely with the, quote, retooling of modernity, but also with the cultivation of what he termed in another text, what the tools of conviviality. Those more radical instantiations of mutual care and community that would serve a true planetary commons in which there are no sacrificial communities and no such forms of infrastructural apartheid. As such, energy inequity resonates with the above-mentioned calls for a degrowth communism, which recognizes that endless accumulation, for example in the form of green or renewable capitalism, is simply incommensurable with planetary well-being. It also resonates with Jason Moore's critique of, quote, cheap energy, a variation of his more familiar cheap nature, a term that he uses to name the abstraction and commodification of the biosphere, inclusive of peasant labor in service to fossil capitalism. And would you, the next slide? Thank you. As is abundantly clear, there is no cheap energy. There is only cheap because heavily subsidized fuel. Fuel whose actual costs, both human and non, are externalized beyond the visual field of the consumer. Aligned with arguments by Marxian critics such as Moore and certainly Gortz, energy justice practitioners have thus and increasingly called for energy democracy over and against mere energy transition. The latter too often a bait and switch by the fossil fuel industry interested to simply electrify petroculture. The struggle for energy democracy demands that we not only collectivize the control of energy, but that we simultaneously recognize the imperative to decolonize extant energy infrastructures framed by conventional mechanisms of dispossession and settler colonial terror. Put simply, the Sahara, quote, ought not be a battery for Europe. And I'm citing the After Oil School there. In considering the degree to which petroculture, or the world created by hydrocarbons, is effectively reproduced through campaigns for mass electrification that not only perpetuate cycles of accumulation long tethered to the fossil fuel industries, but which also fail to militate against the atomistic social organizations abetted by fossil fuel modernity, energy justice practitioners also heed another of Illich's notable arguments, this time regarding the virtue of the bicycle. Discounting obvious material inputs like steel and rubber and modern bicycle technology, Illich nonetheless celebrated this two-wheeled vehicle because of its potential to be truly autonomous from a labor perspective, operating within the energetic constraints that he deemed necessary for participatory democracy and collective flourishing. Conventional bicycles mobilize mostly locally harvested energy, that is on the scale of the individual rider. Now, certainly, the planetary forces at work in biopolitical articulations of the city are deeply implicated on a bodily level. If the city is a, quote, mobile assemblage of contingent subjects, then the notion of any autonomous subject, including a cyclist, does not hold. But while recognizing that the project of decolonizing shared public spaces beyond that this project extends beyond differently abled individual subjects, in what follows, I nonetheless look to the speed of the conventional bicycle as in fact a model, if perhaps for a more humble project, a model for what Illich and his contemporaries saw as an ethical slowness in the face of our, quote, speed-stunned imaginations. Now, that said, Illich did in fact acknowledge the multiscalar politics at work in the production of urban space and persisted in his radical claim regarding transport and bicycles. In proposing that we must, quote, travel the road to productive social relations at the speed of a bicycle, he implicitly embraces a mobile ontology of space and thus does in fact account for contingent actors moving through the uneven infrastructures of the global city. In the present study, I too reflect on the centrality of speed to the rapidly disintegrating infrastructures of too late capitalism, and the virtue of the bicycle's pace for disrupting capital flows that hinge on immediacy and hyper-consumption, flows enabled by overinvestment in automobility. As a literary studies scholar, I also explored the utility of speculative fiction for modeling more ethical speeds. Not the, quote, terracycles at play in Delaney's dystopian energy future, but perhaps something more like the stationary bike, centered in Alvaro Munoz's short film Hombre Electrico, translated as The Electric Man, in which the protagonist, Gaston, provides power, literally pedal power, to fuel various moments in the lives of a fairly isolated community in the Chilean desert. If our so-called autonomy in fact requires massive amounts of energy in order to annihilate space, then Munoz's bike offers more than a quirky glimpse into a post-oil world. The next slide. To some extent, Hombre Electrico illustrates the affective state conjured by what Stephanie Lemenager terms petromelancholia, the feeling of loss associated with the death of carbon-intensive joy. Although the film operates somewhat differently, emphasizing largely low-carbon pleasures. The bike powers a record player and it illuminates a birthday party, allowing for a grandfather to dance with his granddaughter. These are the smaller joys still possible in a world of limited power. Thus, the film implicitly invites reflection on the utopian promise of reorganizing power, perhaps to serve not the hyperconsumption of the kinetic elite, but more mundane, less resource-intensive pursuits. Gaston's bike answers Ilyach's call for a minimum energy economy and one that literally moves at the speed of a bicycle. In the next slide. Thank you. This illustration of what we might understand as what I'm terming the chronotype of the bicycle exposes the enabling myths of petrocultural violence. Carbon-intensive modes of flourishing depend upon a planet-sprawling network of material and digital highways that the film and the fictions, to which I shall turn shortly, work to disrupt. The bicycle operating as a kind of revolutionary interruption teeming with possibility. Of course, interruptions can also be problematic, and bikes have only recently come to be seen as interruptions, or alternatives, that is, to otherwise motorized automobility. A century ago, which is to say a far more popular era in studies of cycling and cycle culture, the bicycle resonated quite differently. Work on its affordances, notably Jeremy Withers, on H.G. Wells and the Findesek writings around transportation technologies and various techno-futurisms, also reveals the slippery position of this, quote, rolling signifier in relation to the automobile and its nascence, when bikes were first seen as alternatives. In New York and London, for example, the bicycle hadn't annihilated space since the days of the velocipede. Bikes would eventually register as patriotic, part of the effort to reduce steel production, or as wisely thrifty, given the prohibitive cost of the automobile for the masses. The latter continues to be a source of ridership in the face of increasing transportation insecurity. The automobile industry, despite its rising costs, having successfully vanquished most other means of transport and leaving the poor essentially stranded. One imagines a latter-day version of Vittorio De Sico's 1948 film Bicycle Thieves, with scores of largely undocumented agricultural workers in places like South Florida taking the place of the tragic Antonio. And that's where I live, by the way. In such a transportation landscape, the bicycle seems less a utopian prospect for the disruption of ceaselessly moving capital than simply an unreliable mode of transport. Sure, we can easily trouble notions of, quote, access in urban landscapes where the causes of mobility justice are global in scale and thus insurmountable without a thorough deconstruction of conventional understandings of movement and space. One that recognizes that urban spaces are produced through the movement of political subjects already endowed with forms of mobility capital, such as passports or digital paychecks. But what of basic reliability? What does it mean to provide reliable transportation to the working poor? The picaresque figures of the global city for whom mobility is not associated with freedom, but is often forced. Indeed, how does a municipality provide not only accessible, but also reliable modes of energy and transportation, particularly for communities long peripheralized by global networks of fossil capital? Whether in the agricultural corridors of South Florida, the informal housing settlements in, for example, Sao Paulo in Brazil, where increasing numbers of workers are cut off from central business districts, or the transit-impoverished living in the foreclosed landscapes of U.S. cities like Detroit, or the increasingly pathologized streets of New York. Critically, in the case of Sao Paulo or New York City, other questions pertaining to vulnerability also arise around bicycles. In this case, the e-bikes employed by the deliveristas who are at the mercy of food delivery apps that make their journeys ever more treacherous and their employment ever more precarious. It goes without saying that DoorDash or any number of delivery apps whose efficacy relies, on the violent exploitation of their couriers ought to complicate conventional understandings of reliability, just as Moore's coinage of cheap energy ought to complicate popular understandings of affordability. But this is clearly not the case, owing to the wildly successful media campaigns that continue to obscure and occasionally vilify labor, a move necessary to shore up popular faith in fossil-fueled currents of consumption. It is precisely such media campaigns that are also responsible for the continued allure of the automobile, particularly outside of urban cores. However fantastical the myth of reliability may be in the face of crippling traffic, eroding highway infrastructures, and catastrophic levels of atmospheric carbon, not only are most forms of, quote, alternative transportation dismissed outright, public transit, for example, however superior in terms of commute times and productivity, having ceded ground to new highway construction, something like bicycle infrastructure barely even enters the conversation. And not because of any rational explanation, but simply a delusion manufactured by various petrofictions. So thus, before turning to the chronotope of the bicycle as represented in the growing genre of cyclepunk, it seems crucial to examine this delusion. To first consider the many fictions celebrating what Gortz would famously read as an atomizing steel cage, and one that would produce the notorious arrogance embodied by such fictional characters as Upton Sinclair's iconic oil magnate, in the 1927 industry novel, Oil. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the chronotope of the automobile and then petro and oil fictions before getting to our conversation about bikes and cyclepunk. Could I see the next slide? Thank you. So, in American literary studies, the road, both literal and symbolic, has historically operated as a common heuristic for reading character and plot. Students follow its movement as an analog for all manner of human interaction. It is a theater where events unfold, where the reader is invited into wondrous adventures, marvelous freedoms. Who will forget the opening line of Oil? Quote, "The road ran smooth and flawless, precisely 14 feet wide. The edges trimmed as if by shears, a ribbon of gray concrete rolled out over the valley by a giant hand." A century later, American viewers of the blockbuster film Ferrari would feel that same exhilaration, the screen as a windshield boasting the glimmering concrete of the Italian countryside. If the wagon heralded freedom for the morally impoverished fantasies of an earlier settler Arcadia, the automobile would expedite the wholesale development of whatever remained. Cultural theorist Mikhail Bakhtin once recognized the chronotope of the road as a common figuration of capital's appropriative impulses. That is, the necessarily teleological framework that allows for actors as literary or filmic heroes to move along the prodigal road toward some sort of desirable end. In keeping with contemporary accounts of automobility and its freedoms of the ilk that Ilyich and Gortz take to task, one might consider Jack Kerouac's 1957 novel of privileged self-discovery, published in the immediate wake of the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, in which Kerouac, utilizes this familiar trope as a means of achieving individual freedom for his band of beatnik misfits. That any mention of the material means of their adventure, funny quips about petrol or a nap at a filling station, would be subordinated to the fantasy of automobility certainly makes sense against the backdrop of a self-congratulatory post-war America. As Richard Wright was attending the Bandung Conference, for nations not aligned with the fossil-fueled mandates of imperial hegemons such as the US and the UK, whose freedoms were largely won by colonized peoples, the Beats were gassing up their cars and motorcycles. Also acknowledging the alarming myopia necessary to completely ignore the material forces that enable automotive, quote, freedom, cultural critic and energy humanist Patricia Jaeger centered Kerouac's novel in her foundational essay on petrofiction and the sublimated energy, what she called the energy unconscious of American motorists. Per Jaeger, while there is surely evidence of contemporary energy anxiety in the book, Popular critics were long content to ignore any such material concerns, instead privileging more palatable themes. But as our sedimented petro habits are increasingly revealed by critics in light of the eroding landscapes of petro-modernity, sorry, lots of petro-neologisms here, in light of the eroding landscapes of petro-modernity, many of which are now in flames, energy humanists are revisiting such classic texts with new eyes. The voluminous attention to Moby Dick, a critique of another celebrated source of oil and one published well before Sinclair's oil, is a clear example of this shift. Although the critical turn toward, quote, reading for oil is more amply displayed in texts that may have never found themselves labeled as oil fictions in the first place. Such is certainly the case with Helena Maria Viramontes' 1995 novel Under the Feet of Jesus, wherein the invisibilized energies of fossil fuel modernity are laid bare, but have somehow also been sublimated by readers for nearly 3 decades, privileging more obvious references to the grueling nature of agricultural labor than to the endless references to fossilized carbon that quite literally suffuse the novel's plot. Energy humanist Jeffrey Insko has notably pointed out, in reference to this novel about migrant farm workers slowly creeping along the LA freeways, the substitution of a kind of infrastructural stuckness for the sort of freedom usually ascribed to automobility. Insko treats the novel as a, quote, work of petrofiction, and one that has much to say about racialized extractive capitalism and about how oil and its appurtenances, especially automobility and infrastructure, shape and sustain inequalities and disparate experiences, the unevenness and injustice produced by petromodernity, end quote. This application of Amitav Ghosh's 1992 coinage of petrofiction is a useful means of reconfiguring what we take for granted as petroculture and instead acknowledging the degree to which all literature produced in an oil-electric context, to cite Graham MacDonald, is in fact a sort of petrofiction. Sputtering along in their dated Chevrolet station wagon, this family of 7, and I'm referring back to Under the Feet of Jesus, they know no such beatnik magic. With a tattered Phillips 66 map as their gospel and the bright orange lights of the 76 petrol station as their setting sun, Viramontes' family enjoys a very different fate. I've elsewhere written about Viramontes' explicit figuration of a kind of memento mori in the form of the LA tar pits, whose Faustian presence shrouds the narrative. The novel mobilizes the bones and tarry matter therein, more frequently associated with the pyrocenic fantasies of petroculture, as a metaphor for the protagonist's bones, which will literally grease the engine of California's vast empire of agro-capital, or, for the protagonist in a final monologue, its highways. In a sense, the positioning of the tar pits operates similarly to the sorts of prolepsies imminent to popular climate fictions, or cli-fi, bending narrative time to effectively suture a vaster geological epoch, the Carboniferous, with that of an individual human life. Although when one imagines narrative prolepsis of the sort that has become commonplace in cli-fi, one usually thinks of the creation of dystopian future, not present, one to be found beyond the horizon of extractive capitalism. This is the future that readers experience in another road novel that also bears no allegiance to the pretense of automobility that we find in Kerouac. Cormac McCarthy's 2006 novel, The Road, in which a father and son navigate the crumbling ruins of petromodernity, ambling along with their discarded shopping cart and battling it out at the end of the world. In a novel nearing 300 pages, the, quote, action mostly consists of endless passages documenting the gradations of a putrid gray sky, presumably suffused with whatever industrial effluvia secured their miserable situation, and I imagine massive amounts of carbon. McCarthy's isn't a typical tale of dystopian horror. There's very little action, and the father's heroism, while of a similar stripe to those, quote, men of action, rightfully derided by feminist critics like Ursula Le Guin, his heroism resonates quite differently. Theirs is a journey propulsed by hunger. McCarthy's itinerant narrative is a far cry from the sorts of coming-of-age tales celebrated in something like On the Road, itinerancy in the earlier novel operating instead in service to a fairly typical Bildungsroman. Okay, so I'm going to switch from talking about, road novels and petrofictions and get to cyclepunk. Switch to the next slide. Thank you. Excuse me. So I take for granted that the failure to transition away from fossil-fueled conceptions of the good, of the sort celebrated in Kerouac's novel, is largely a matter of cultural imagination and political will. So too, that the transition or the quote end of fossil fuels is in fact imminent, which may account for the sentiment of a novel like McCarthy's. In this way, I also joined practitioners in the growing solar punk movement. Solar punk, or the world made by sun-drenched, solar-powered, multi-species reciprocity, is a genre that takes the collapse of fossil capitalism as a given, and it usefully rejects the cultural arrogance of climate fictions that remain framed by eschatological notions of apocalypse, a teleology rightfully rejected by Indigenous studies scholars who placed the apocalypse several centuries ago. While the burgeoning genre of solar punk has been appropriately criticized for occasionally invisibilizing the energy-intensive transformation of sunshine into its many solar-powered utopias, it nonetheless offers a useful point of departure for imagining not merely economic degrowth, but something like a just energy future. Arguably, what I'm calling cyclepunk takes the next step. The quote, biketopias that I examine here are worlds of magical disruption, protracted conveyance, and radical empathy, born of forced embodiment. Rejecting too late capitalist myths of invigorating speed, readers travel alongside figures like those centered in, for example, Power Paula's new graphic memoir, All My Bicycles, which is an which is an exquisite narration of the bikes that have literally and metaphorically framed various stages of the author's life. Where the theft of a bicycle, as in Bicycle Thieves, momentarily catapults the author into hardship, but where the gift of a bicycle also conjures a joy so rarely seen amidst the metropolis that forms the backdrop of each vignette. But more than an homage to cycle-powered joy and a correlative rebuke of automobility, the text also mimics a radical cadence in its strangely disruptive form. All My Bicycles, in its itinerant movement through time and space, heralds the possibility of a world beyond that of the narrow imaginings of the too-late petro-subject. Power Paula, like Ellie Blue, who coined the term biketopia in her ongoing series dedicated to, quote, feminist bicycle science fiction, creates new pathways for collective flourishing, human and more than human critters stumbling towards something like energy democracy at the end of the world. Blue's volumes operate similarly to Paula's memoir, many operating as succinct praxes for imagining such radical rejections of petro-modernity. Excuse me. Some also center that most benighted aspect of renewable power, intermittency, and the mortal fear of enduring a world of limited power. Contra what might seem the ableist rhetoric of, quote, pedal-powered utopian worlds and the pleas to low-carbon pleasure that often accompany them, these are not stories merely about bikes, but of the insurgent temporality of the bicycle, showcasing intermittency not as tragic interruption, but as a cadence tethered to a different configuration of productivity, joy, and abundance. This is the cadence of what Scheller terms a, quote, mobile commons. Dynamic gathering of contingent actors, not to be confused with the outlaw truckers and convoy, for whom the road is not a commons, but a site of entrepreneurial innovation. Such generative figurations of intermittency may also be found in some solar punk works. In particular, a popular tale by Becky Chambers that usefully positions the protagonist within a cosmogony based upon cosmic, quote, cycles, and features a pedaling hero who navigates their half-wilded planet in a pedal-powered T-cart. In Psalm for the Wild Built, quote, sibling decks, pedals along a narrative arc riddled with all manner of interruption, each affording grand and not so grand opportunities where a more conventional hero might glimpse only obstacles. One such, quote, interruption is the relationship with the robot Mosscap, at once a random configuration of matter and a source of revelation for the itinerant decks. Mosscap hails from the countryside, which remained uninhabited after the, quote, transition. It, for Mosscap explicitly rejects the assignation of gender-restricting pronouns, is, quote, wild-built, and operates as a guide of sorts, although its movement follows a strange trajectory. Mosscap is motivated by thoughtful observations, occupying a sustained present without any notion of a future or past. Mosscap's name even derives from a lovely and fleeting contemplation about a variety of mushrooms. It also reminds Dex that, quote, consciousness, or that which would presumably distinguish Dex from Mosscap, is a, quote, resource-heavy artifact of the, quote, factory age. Importantly, however, this is not a plea to collapse the differential agency of these two figures, nor does this novel peddle in nostalgia. In fact, far from the sorts of pastoralizing violence of the solar punk worlds that have come under fire, Chambers' fictional Panga is precisely the sort of low-energy paradise that we ought to be building. Panga is a paradise, and I'm not sure if it's Panga or Panga, I think, is a paradise whose inhabited half adheres to the socialist mandate issued by Ilyich and many others to curtail global energy consumption and the modes of infrastructural concealment that sustain it. Panga brings to life a sort of half-earth socialism that moves at the speed of a bicycle, while also, and importantly, resisting eco-modernist gestures toward vilifying the city. Here, the city is a healthy, thriving place, not merely a satanic mill positioned against the countryside. In Panga, there is also ample bike joy, with sibling Dex enjoying a smooth downhill bike ride, and there are glimpses into Dex's labors with occasional references to aching calves. But mostly there is the promise of a radically different orientation to space. Not unlike Moscat, the movement of Little Tea Cart is not incentivized by conventional notions of productivity. It is instead powered by the fictional, quote, god of the cycle, who encourages contemplation and rest, and even venerates sleep. Dex's pillow actually enjoys mention in Chambers', quote, treatise on sleep, which is quite a productive critique of the ceaselessly moving nature of capital. It's also worth mentioning that Dex is non-binary, perhaps a nod to the fecundity of the bicycle as a, quote, rolling signifier, whose slippery ontology has been associated with queer, non-binary, and transgender identity by several critics. In Dex, we see that the, quote, cycling body represents opposition to a concrete land of fixity and stasis. Perhaps this is why Chamber also emphasizes Muscap's resistance to pronouns. In any case, this queering of the cycling body invites discussion about the intimacies between energy and energy infrastructures and gender, such as we see in the above-mentioned Sultana's Dream, as well as in the memoir by graphic novelist Power Paula, to which I will finally turn as my final example of the bicycle's affordances for cultivating a sort of fugitive timescale. Okay, the next slide. Thank you. So, On My Bicycles is a narrative whose form also mirrors the radical cadence of a bicycle, but it departs formally from such works as A Song for the Wild Build. On My Bicycles is a memoir that also employs visual rhetoric in service of disrupting the narrative space of the city. An autographical novel that seems a concise praxis for thinking through its slippery ontology. Her second such memoir after the 2015 Virus Tropical, which is credited for similarly painting nations as, quote, diasporic processes and, quote, translocal phenomena over and against discrete states. Author Power Paula has been credited with producing groundbreaking work that, quote, explores the tensions between groundedness and nomadism, turning away from enclosed notions of home, end quote. Mobilizing what James Square describes as the, quote, kind of minoritarian feminism based around transformative encounters, transhuman engagement with nature, a transfeminist combination of Baroque excess with feminist clutter. This is how I shall read On My Bicycles, a work that further develops the notion of the, quote, bicycle as home, signifying not itinerancy or alienation, but a means of cultivating, quote, an alternative sense of community. In this sense, the bike is indeed a means of convivial disruption, a key to the mobile commons and one hinge to a different understanding of time. On My Bicycles begins with an epigraph from poet Ocean Vuong that underlines what we might understand as a standard capitalist appropriation of time and one that would normally organize such spaces. Quote, because freedom, I am told, is nothing but the distance between the hunter and his prey. The narrative then transports the reader not merely out of time, beginning in 2003 and then moving to 1996, but also outside of the spatial logic of such forms of appropriation. I should say, academicians in my home field of Anglophone world literatures often center discussion around the so-called world of world literature in terms of the time space of colonial capitalist appropriation, quote, tracking capital, I'm citing the Warwick School, in light of the intimacies between literary forms and the global commodity chains that they often reflect. Recent work on the politically contingent nature of space has also focused on the city, including, of course, titles like Scheller's above-mentioned book, along with work such as environmental justice practitioner and colleague Ashley Dawson's 2016 Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change. Extreme cities demonstrates that if cities are, quote, active mechanisms for producing uneven mobilities, unequal bodies, and unbundled infrastructures, end quote, they can also be revolutionary sites for solidarity building. In Dawson's case, in New York City in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. This sort of revolutionary world building may also be glimpsed in All My Bicycles, a memoir that moves slowly and thoughtfully through several urban spaces, garnering community with each rotation. The book begins with a question about its ending. I'm not sure how to end this comic. I could talk about my bike that got stolen. Perhaps beginning at the end is itself an explicit gesture to some sort of temporal disruption. The book begins, in fact, with this theft, which catalyzes not an end, but a beginning of, quote, systematic revelations produced through, quote, drawing and writing, and also primarily cycling. A memoir that is as much about process and perception and movement as it is about memory. Power Paula essentially narrates the production of the terrain in which she writes and rides. The first vignette closes with another strange narrative gesture, a sort of provocation to consider the transitory nature of otherwise given spaces. As in her first memoir, she also notes that for her, the, quote, bicycle is home. When I dream about it, she remarks, I know it is speaking to me. This writing into being and producing space, or, quote, home, through the experience of an object constantly on the move, resonates with the above-mentioned argument regarding the state as a diasporic process. So, too, with the virtue of a mobile ontology that operates on multiple scales simultaneously. The bicycle as moving home of the otherwise itinerant subject disrupts more familiar narrative journeys. In this case, among a set of disparate geographies, both spatial across Ecuador and Argentina, and also temporal, which is to say various moments of the author's life. It also, as was the case with Chambers' sibling Dex, disrupts otherwise putatively stable categories such as gender, queering space as it rolls along. Three discrete bicycles, the Chinese, the Palmyran, and the Salvadorian, function as framing devices for this non-teleological, wholly irreverent coming-of-age story. The three bikes also catalyze various forms of companionship, thus also suggesting the bike as a tool for conviviality. The book interweaves little snippets of bike history, bike love, and bike tech, i.e. notes about chains and gears, with the various forms of companionship that the author experiences through this at once ephemeral and yet amply material object. While in some instances it does conquer space conventionally, quote, broadening her horizons upon independence, similarly to the velocipedes of the 19th century, it more often affords an imaginative withdrawal from what we might understand as the ontological space produced by the motor car. Sarah Ahmed notably instructed readers to acknowledge their orientation to the objects and sites of power whose positions determined or delimited their lived experiences. This is something that Blue also attempts in an odd little story about an agential and orphaned bicycle who remains forever unhoused in the drowned world that petroculture made. All My Bicycle also participates in this radical reorientation of space and of the object qua home that is the bicycle, a home that she cultivates throughout with the many friends and lovers with whom she travels. The book also makes space literally for the more than human beings who are no longer reducible to setting. The, quote, landscape, whether of Quito or Medellin or Cali, is also animated, not merely by the chaos of motorized traffic, but by a persistent non-human presence in the form of an alligator, with whom the author occasionally communes and who, it is implied, ultimately rides away on one of her bicycles. The reader is left to imagine Aurorita, a compact city bike whose geometry is similar to a BMX, comfortably positioned between two reptilian legs. The various cityscapes are also animated, not merely coming into being through the narrator's long walks and bike rides, but also pulsing with radical conviviality. Characters often pathologized, for example, sex workers and addicts, are necessarily centered because one cannot otherize as easily from the saddle. Historically disregarded humans, often painted as antagonists in conventionally popular literary works, are no longer, quote, obstacles, which is a term that Sinclair's protagonist uses multiple times, but they're also friends and lovers. They are protagonists and they participate in the active and daily remaking of the cities in which the narrator roams. This is the conviviality of the commons and of shared spaces framed by abundance. If there is to be a retooling or merely a retooling of modernity, this is precisely the sort of inhabited space for which we ought to be striving. this is democracy. Sorry, excuse me. This is energy democracy at the end of the world. And in the larger project from which this talk derives, this is the world that I intend to center. Whether the actual instantiations of energy democracy in cities like New York, the radical bike infrastructures of Portland, Oregon, however historically flawed from the perspective of access and inclusion, which is another conversation that I take up in other sections. My own attempts at a speculative future and a post-submersion Miami, or the many biketopian universes illustrated by authors like Howard Paula and Ellie Blue. And I'm gonna stop there. So thank you. And on the next slide, I just wrote thank you and added my email if you wanted to get in touch. But thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Balkan. You had mentioned Professor Jennifer Wenzel in your talk. Hers is one of the talks we'll be having next month as part of the same series. So thank you for mentioning her. And we'll now have questions and comments from the audience. Roy has his hand up. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Balkan. It was a fresh perspective of looking at things. When you mentioned Moby Dick as a petroculture novel, it got me thinking, because Moby Dick has the oil as a living being, a sentient being, and the characters have some kind of relationship with it, mostly hostile though, but still a relationship. And I was thinking, I also thought of the the series of American movies about the Volkswagen Beetle that has some kind of life. I forget the name. I think it's called Herbie. There's a Volkswagen Beetle that has some kind of life, and again the characters have some relationship with it. So I was thinking, when we think of biketopian culture, could we envision a post-humanist relationship with the bicycle itself? Because like petroculture doesn't affect everybody the same way. Not everyone can have the same kind of bicycle. People will have individual needs, so they'll have to customize it. So a differently abled person can't have the same bicycle as somebody who's athletic, for example. So they'd have a unique relationship with it, right? So I was thinking, could we envision it in a post-human way, where the more than human also includes the machine itself, the bicycle itself. It becomes also a home, like you said, but also a companion, perhaps. That was what I was thinking.
Oh yeah, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should say too, in the book project, one of the chapters is on sort of uneven cyclescapes and looking at like various types of infrastructure and the variety of different bicycles that are adapted to individuals' sort of abilities and certainly access and so forth. Also, in terms of a sort of agential bicycle, such as like Herbie, I'd forgotten completely about that movie. That's some of the biketopian stories collected in the Blue anthologies feature these strangely agential bikes that sort of like help us to sort of also I think deconstruct our relationships to and with them. One in particular, and I think I kind of alluded to it, but one in particular is a story in the 2017 collection that you might enjoy by Jesse Quack. But yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Balkan, I had not so much a question, but a comment to your talk. Sure. And I can understand how important the motorcycle is, for example, for the American cultural imagination. But then towards the mid-19th century, when the railways were introduced in British India, because the railways followed a certain timetable, the trains had a particular time of arrival and departure, that in one sense influenced Indian conceptions of time itself. I mean, that was also the time when India had modern clocks or watches that were entering the market in India, the Georgian calendar that was adopted by the British, by the East India government. So I was thinking of parallels between the motorcycle in the American imagination, bicycles, as you went on to mention, and also the train, for example, which continues to be a major feature in Indian daily lives and so on. So it's just a comment.
Oh, sure. But that's something that I think about a lot, right? Because the before in the States, before the interstate highway system, there was the the sort of like much mythologized locomotive that would effectively transect the landscape, and that was mythologized by writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Walt Whitman, right, as this like sort of simultaneously kind of sublime mode of transport that could effectively convey folks from the city to the country, right, thereby sustaining that binary, but that also over time became, was recognized as a source of kind of social deterioration, environmental decay, and all of that. So you see the kind of sensibility around the locomotive and the relationship to it kind of shifting over time, and particularly with the advent of automobility here too.
Yes, and also how the locomotive is linked very directly to extraction in the form of coal, for example, since it was steam powered, and coal and extraction in that sense as well. So yes, thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Are there any more questions, comments, or interventions? If there are no more questions, we could probably conclude today's session. And I would like to thank Professor Stacey Balkan more than anybody else for accepting our invitation and for delivering this fascinating talk. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody in the audience for participating, and thank you to Roy for his question. And Professor Balkan's talk, like all our other talks, is being recorded and will be up on a YouTube channel and also the website of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the University of Hyderabad. And the poster for today's talk was designed by Mabel Susan. So thank you to Mabel, and thank you everybody. Thank you so much for joining, and we hope that you will be joining for the rest of the talks in the series as well. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody.
Thank you, Stacey, for that. That was a very wide-ranging talk indeed. I mean, it covered so much ground. It's incredible what you managed to pack into about 50 minutes or so.
Oh, thank you, Pramod. I hope not too much. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
No, it's fantastic. That range is absolutely what we were looking for, also because it triggers ideas about research projects and future course of direction for most people. So thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Thank you so much. Take care, all.